John Roberts is the most successful Republican politician of the last 25 years.
Brilliant.
He is hardly an institutionalist centrist calling balls and strikes. He's calling balls and strikes like Leslie Nielsen did in The Naked Gun. the pitch is halfway down the plate and he's called the ball or the strike based on which side wins.
Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Andrew O'Hare, Executive Editor at Salon. It is my great pleasure to welcome today officially my former boss, former Editor-in-Chief of Salon, that's kind of a footnote here, and best-selling author David Daley. Welcome.
Pleasure to be back home. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. We're going to talk about your new book, which is perfectly timed for this incredibly contentious election. It is called Antidemocratic.
A title we can say this time.
Yes, we can say that. Yes. Dave's first book, a bestseller. Are we going to say the title?
Up to you.
I think we are, and
I'm not in charge here anymore.
The video team will decide what to. Dave's first book, Rat Fucked, which was a national bestseller, is in many ways a precursor to this one. This goes into more detail. Let's read the subtitle, which is Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. We'll get into the details of this, Dave, but first of all, we've got an election coming up. You might have noticed that. I assume that I do know you pretty well. I have a pretty good sense of where you fall on the ideological spectrum. I assume you agree with the general, premise that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have changed the dynamics of this election a lot. But have they changed it enough to address the kinds of issues that you talk about in this book?
I think that is the $100,000 question as we head into this election season. This is going to be a very tight and very close election, and as we know, the Electoral College is really what matters, and in 2020 we're talking about essentially 45,000 votes in 3 very competitive states that made the difference. Even though Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million,
right,
it was those 45,000 votes that made the difference. And the kinds of litigation that we saw after 2020 was kind of a clown show. It was Rudy Giuliani in front of Four Seasons Landscaping. It was Cleta Mitchell and a bit of a pile up. That's not going to be the case this time. I think they're better prepared. I think there's better lawyers working on this. Laura Trump at the RNC has already said that there's about 75 to 90 cases that the RNC is involved in, either as a litigant or filing amicus briefs in about 24 states. These involve some of the big white shoe conservative law firms, Consovoy and McCarthy and others in DC. Rudy Giuliani is not involved. And so what I worry about is another replay of Bush versus Gore in 2000. If the margin is anywhere near as close as it was in 2000, when we're talking about 550 votes maybe.
In a state that was literally the tipping point, yeah.
Absolute tipping point. We are going to see a 6-week period, I would imagine, no matter what, between Election Day and the meeting of the Electoral College in mid-December, that is going to be like a second election period, except 180 million of us will vote on Election Day, and if this winds up before the Supreme Court the same way Bush versus Gore does, and there's a million different scenarios you could conjure up that gets it there, you will have 9 people making that decision, 6 of which have essentially been appointed or trained or in the pocket of Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society in some way.
Which is something we'll talk about in a minute, yeah.
3 of whom worked on Bush versus Gore as
Which is
lawyers.
amazing. That's just amazing. Yeah. Who were those 3?
Those are John Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett, who essentially proved their conservative bona fides in that moment, and they were fast-tracked to be trusted by the conservative legal movement for these incredibly important spots on the court. I mean, Bush versus Gore, in many ways, was the proof of concept for controlling the court and controlling American elections.
And I think that one of the things that's really important about this book is that you're making the point repeatedly by using the expression, 50-year plot to control American elections, that for understandable reasons, people are focused on the proximate threat of Donald Trump, who is a proximate threat, but the Trump administration, as you just said, was in many respects a clown show. There were a lot of amateurs in the House, and when you have somebody like Rudy Giuliani or Cleta Mitchell or what's her name, Sidney Powell,
right,
involved, it's all going to go south on you because those people were not competent, not well informed, not good with the law. And a lot of what your book is about is a lot of people who are competent,
yes,
are well informed, are intelligent, and are good with the law, have been involved for decades in building for a moment like this, right?
I think that's exactly right. A lot of people believe that this current anti-democratic moment began when Donald Trump descended the gilded elevator at Trump Tower. And actually, you can trace the roots of this moment back, decades earlier than that. The folks who have been plotting the conservative legal movement and this truly anti-democratic moment of entrenched minority rule in so much of our politics have been planning for this for a long time. You can track it back many decades, as I try to do in this book, and there's a really good reason for it. They were, and are still to this day, trying to achieve political policy goals that majorities of Americans disagree with. And the only way to pull this off was by capturing the courts. And they learned this time and time again over this entire period, which inspired and egged them on to sort of go further into this idea. You don't need 218 members of the House and 51 members of the Senate,
right,
or the White House if you can put 5 people who you know and trust in lifelong, unelected, unaccountable positions on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Even better if you have 6.
Even better if you have 6.
And I think one of the key points here in talking about this as a 50-year plot, there are lots of legal cases that you discuss, but we can focus on the 2 headline-making cases that are to some extent the centerpiece. And most of our viewers will have at least heard of these cases. One of them being the Citizens United case that had basically opened the door to unlimited corporate dark money in the political process. The other one being Shelby County versus Holder, that being Attorney General Eric Holder, which did not literally undo the Voting Rights Act, but removed its teeth. And you discuss some of the very specific ways that it allowed southern states and potentially other states as well to gerrymander, disenfranchise poor people, black people, people who are likely to vote Democratic. But those 2 court decisions, as famous as they were, weren't just the result of some conservative principles coming to the fore, a new interpretation of the Constitution from some of these people, or some sort of compromise position. Your argument is this was literally the culmination of decades of strategy.
Yes. What the conservative legal movement has built in many ways is a hermetically sealed circle. When they bring these cases, they have the Federalist Society doing the research and creating the sort of legal hothouse theories that make up the amicus briefs that they also fund. They fund the litigators and the expensive law firms. They fund the astroturfed nonprofits that go out and find the litigants that bring these cases. And they are serving as essentially the one-stop shopping transmission belt for installing the judges who will hear these cases. And then the same funders oftentimes are behind things like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council,
which writes bills for
that then take the cases once they're allowed to gerrymander or pass voter ID bills and bring them back down to the state legislatures and enact them in all of these places. So what you begin to see is that the fix is in at just about every single level, and that's certainly the case in Citizens United and also in Shelby County.
You make a very persuasive case that essentially the right built a movement. It isn't a grassroots movement, but it can be called a movement over a period of decades to achieve these results. Who, from their point of view, would be like, whether they're famous or not, the heroes or leaders or key figures in that movement? Who are the individuals that maybe we don't know about who played a big role?
I think Salon readers will probably recognize the name of Lewis Powell.
Former Supreme Court Justice, although we're going before that.
Well, the amazing thing about Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court is that Powell is sort of a classic Southern lawyer, genteel racist. Mm-hmm. And he is seen as sort of the gentleman, the courtly gentleman of the Marble Palace, is how Time magazine described him. And folks in Richmond, where his biographer says he never met a black man as an equal, might beg to differ. Powell was chair of the school committee in Richmond during Brown versus Board, which he believed to be wrongly decided. He couldn't imagine why the court would reach that decision. He does not engage in the sort of maximal resistance that other places did. And
he didn't stand in the schoolhouse door. He would never have used blatantly racist language in the most obvious sense. He had no affiliation with the Klan. That's what we're talking about, right?
He was not Bull Connor.
Right.
But he simply didn't do anything to change. So 5 years after Brown, when Powell steps down as school board chair, you can count the number of black students in white schools on one hand in Richmond, Virginia. All of which is just a buildup to say this is not a nice man. This is a man who in the 1960s is calling Martin Luther King a totalitarian. He is talking about the civil rights movement in horrific ways. And he writes a memo for the Chamber of Commerce in the early 1970s that effectively says, we on the right are besieged. The idea of this kind of white right grievance, is not new to us.
It wasn't invented in 2016. Yeah.
Precisely. And Powell writes a memo for the Chamber of Commerce that says, we are going to lose to the consumer movement and the environmental movement and the radicals in the media and on campuses if the right does not get involved in a big way. And the best opportunity for us would be to take advantage of our chances in the courts and to try and take over the courts. Well, he writes this memo 3 months later. Richard Nixon appoints him to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is quite a career ladder.
Interesting, yeah.
Funny how that happens. And as a Supreme Court justice, his rulings in some of the key campaign finance cases of the 1970s helped pave the way for Citizens United. And there's also a big voting rights case that very much influences a young John Roberts. So Powell's memo, I think there's some on the left who probably overstate its influence, and I try not to do that here. But it's undeniable that it inspired the Koch brothers, that the Koch brothers wrote about it and gave speeches about it in the early 1970s, that it inspired the big conservative founders on the right, the folks at the foundations like Scaife and Olin, Coors, to do things like build the Heritage Foundation. And they built an entire network of conservative public interest law firms that they tried to use in the same way that the left was using those kinds of law firms to fight DDT and Ralph Nader's consumer movement and the like. Much of what they built didn't really work or prove super effective.
Right.
And so it took a second really smart conservative, a man named Michael Horowitz, who
that's a fascinating
I think is
story
a new
in this
piece
fascinating story in this book.
of this, who
former liberal from New York City,
a former liberal from New York City, who I don't think people really understand or know about. And Horowitz comes in about almost a decade later and does a memo for the Scaife Foundation, Richard Mellonscafe, the big
Sure.
conservative funder, probably gave $1 billion to conservative causes over the course of his lifetime. And what Horowitz argues is that the structure and the framework that Powell has described doesn't make a lot of sense anymore because Republicans don't have the bright young lawyers in order to staff it. They have mediocre legal minds, he thought. And what had to be done was Republicans had to win hearts and minds in law schools. They had to build this from the ground up, not as Powell wanted to from the top down.
I have to say that in a certain way, I find this guy's vision impressive.
It's brilliant.
Because he understood that what they lacked was the intellectual bench and the actual, training and background in educational framework. And that seems like it was such a key part of the whole story.
It's an absolutely huge part because he introduces a handful of young conservative law students in the early 1980s to the conservative funders, and they would together launch and fund something called the Federalist Society, which is probably the biggest ROI that any conservative investment has ever built. And Horowitz, who was really an unknown lawyer in New York prior to writing this report, ends up as chief of staff at Reagan's OMB, which is a really big job at the center of the Reagan administration, where he brings in young Republicans and begins sort of putting folks, good, proper conservatives on the career track. And the same thing happens at the Department of Justice, where all of these young Federalist Society folks come in, along with a young John Roberts, who was not a member of the Federalist Society at the time, but he clerked with William Rehnquist in what was essentially an early version of the Federalist Society in
Chief
his
Justice
chambers
under Nixon.
yes, right. So, and you begin to see how the transmission belt works and functions.
The Horowitz story, I think, is which I really didn't know anything about before reading your book. I had heard his name, but that was it. Is fascinating. And one of the things that stuck with me, in addition to the fact that this guy really was brilliant and farsighted in many respects, he has this critique of the kind of left liberal legal establishment of the time that I found interesting, where he describes them as something of an ideological insiders group that was kind of in this self-congratulatory loop of pushing policies and legal agendas and court decisions. And obviously he thought that the right should emulate that, and
Yes.
they did. But I also wonder, to what extent do you think he was right? To what extent did the left liberal establishment of that time undermine itself? I'm sure you've thought about this.
No, I think it's a great question. Certainly what Horowitz describes in his memo, he goes to a conference at Yale that Charles Halpern, who was one of the geniuses of the liberal public interest law movement of the 60s and 70s, runs, and Horowitz is horrified by what he sees, but he's also sort of amazed by it because it's right out in the open. It's sort of everything he imagined. It's the folks who work at the government agencies under Jimmy Carter. It's the public interest law firms. It is the law professors, and they're all just hanging out together. And he's saying, well, they're all friends, and they all had built sort of an iron triangle that helped further all of their policy goals. And I think he might have imagined that this was the case, and then he got there and saw it and said, this is what we need to do. Mm-hmm. He's like, you can't have a regional system of public interest law firms out in the mountain states in the Pacific Northwest, and you need to be in Washington. You need to be with the people who are making these decisions. You've got to be in the room with them. And he thought that was the model that conservatives needed to build rather than the one that Powell had suggested. And he was right.
Yeah. It's And I guess, we sort of come back around at the end of this 50-year plot, as you describe it, to the situation that we're in right now, which you talked about earlier. And I guess another one of my questions about the 2024 election is, are you frustrated, and I probably know the answer to this question, to see as much as the Kamala Harris Tim Walz ticket has clearly changed the dynamic of this race, and they might win the election, we don't know. But the Democrats once again are playing emergency politics, like the house is on fire, we need to call the fire department, which is what happens in every single election. And they are just concerned with the immediate crisis, like how do we defeat this dangerous person, as opposed to addressing the underlying cause that made Trump possible and the underlying causes that got us here. Like, as long as we keep repeating that pattern, is anything fundamental going to change?
No, as long as we keep repeating that pattern, every election is going to be the most important election of all time, and democracy will always be on the ballot, and we will always have to rush $15 to Nancy Pelosi because she'll be alive forever through our Act Blue accounts. And no, nothing will change forever.
Yeah.
You begin to almost wonder if they like it that way.
I've speculated about that question. I mean, the current president, who we've all kind of forgotten about over the last couple of weeks since he got, my 20-year-old son said he felt some compassion for Joe Biden, who, in his word, got Julius Caesared by people who claimed that they were his friends. I don't know if that's a completely fair analysis, but it could be in the ballpark. But
I think we could all no longer unsee what we saw that night.
That's true. But Biden recently made various proposals about the
Yes.
Supreme Court, which are not going to go anywhere in the near term. But I wondered whether, in the context of all the other crazy news, you thought it was an important moment for the actual president of the United States to say those things.
Amen, because we need to start this conversation, and it needs to be mainstreamed, and it needs to be a part of democratic politics and platforms. Listen, a lot of us said this back in 2020. A lot of us
Sure.
have been saying things like this for a long time, that without serious structural fixes to American politics, there's going to be this entrenched minority rule for a period of time, and that it's only going to get worse over time if we don't do anything about it. So Joe Biden commissioned a blue ribbon panel, and he stuffed the result in a drawer back when Democrats did have a trifecta in Washington and might have been able to do something about this. It would have required blowing up the filibuster. It would have required Manchin and Sinema. I know. But when they had the numbers, the report was stuffed in a drawer. And what happened? Well, the Supreme Court blew up Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs decision. They continued tearing the Voting Rights Act in half and half again and half again. They gave Trump immunity for crimes that he committed in office and essentially turned him into a king and placed him above the law, and did so after slow walking that case for so long that it pushed it off until after the 2024 election. So there's a piece of me that says, I'm glad we've started this conversation, but it's a little too late for the moment that we are in. But it's an important conversation to start, because what we have is a runaway, hijacked U.S. Supreme Court loaded with a conservative supermajority appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote, confirmed by a U.S. Senate that has not actually represented a majority of Americans during those years. And they are unelected, given lifetime powers appointments. They are totally unaccountable to Americans. They have no ethics standards. They deliberate in private. And Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural, says that if we give unfettered power over public policy decisions that affect all of the people, I'm paraphrasing slightly, to the US Supreme Court, and I'm not paraphrasing this, he says the people will cease to be their own rulers. And I would suggest that that is the moment that we are in, that in many ways the people have ceased to be their own rulers. And so what Biden is talking about, I think, is a solid start. Term limits seem like a very wise idea. Americans back them, right? Anytime you start talking about a court reform, people get afraid. There's a Fox News poll that shows 78% of Americans back term limits for the U.S. Supreme Court. This is
theoretically allows
popular.
every president to appoint two, probably two.
Right, and I'm sure they'd find a way to game the system and retirements. But regardless, it's a pretty good start, and also an actual code of ethics with teeth. I mean, if we're going to have this unaccountable lifetime panel making these decisions for us, I would sort of like to know who is funding their lavish luxury vacations. I would like to know who's buying their mother's house for them. I'd like to know who's paying their friends' tuition to fancy private schools. And I'd like to know what kind of business these people have before the US Supreme Court. And the idea that we can't have hearings into this, I mean, this court has been corrupted.
You do your utmost in this book, last question, we'll let you go. You do your utmost in this book to demolish the reputation of Chief Justice John Roberts as this institutionalist, middle road, moderate, seeking compromise, all the things. But you know and I know that we will read a story or a column in the Washington Post or the New York Times in the next 5 days that recycles those cliches about Roberts, that he's seeking to be a moderating influence on people like Alito and Thomas. Why does that keep happening?
I have no idea. This idea that John Roberts will save us, when John Roberts has shown again and again that not only is he not going to save us, he's not your friend. He's not on your side. Listen, John Roberts is the most successful Republican politician of the last 25 years.
Brilliant.
He is hardly an institutionalist centrist calling balls and strikes. He's calling balls and strikes like Leslie Nielsen did in The Naked Gun. The pitch is halfway down the plate and he's called the ball or the strike based on which side wins. What John Roberts has delivered for conservatives and for Republicans over the course of the last 20 years, Citizens United and the unlimited ability of billionaires to flood dark money into our politics, the continued destruction of the Voting Rights Act, which has resounded to the benefit of the Republican Party nationally and in state after state. He has blessed their partisan gerrymanders. He has overseen the end of Roe v. Wade. He has overseen the end of the regulatory state. He has overseen the birth of the major questions doctrine, what has happened on gun control. And what is the truth about all of these cases, none of these results could have been won by conservatives or Republicans through the political process. John Roberts delivered all of these things for them. John Roberts is not a moderate. John Roberts is not a centrist. John Roberts is the most important conservative politician of the last 25 years.
Fantastic. David Daley, former editor of Salon and author of the important new book, Antidemocratic. So good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me by.
Thank you for watching Salon Talks. If you had a good time, why not subscribe right over here so you can get more conversations with your favorite artists, actors, directors, writers, comedians, musicians, politicians, everybody you love, and I love too. And while you're here, why not watch another video right now?